Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Drive Green Ottawa speaker series with Jamie Stuckless. For those of you who don't know us, EnviroCentre is a nonprofit environmental organization based here in Ottawa. Our core mission supports sustainable lifestyles, which means that we encourage people to take action on climate in their own lives, their homes, their workplaces, businesses, their communities, and right here in our city. Our work focuses on 4 key areas: green homes, green transportation, green business, and green lifestyle. Today, we're here to talk about green transportation in Ottawa, and specifically zero emissions, low carbon transportation. But before we get started, we just have a few logistical notes. Firstly, you should understand and note that this session is being recorded and shared online after the event. We ask that you keep yourself muted during the presentation so that everyone is able to hear Jamie speaking. And we'll be monitoring questions in the chat box, so please type them in there and we'll bring them forward to Jamie for a Q&A period following the presentation. So let's get going. I'm happy to say our speaker today is Jamie Stuckless. Jamie is a policy advocate and transportation consultant who has worked in Ontario's active transportation sector for over a decade. During this time, she has collaborated on campaigns to fund hundreds of kilometers of cycling infrastructure, increase walking and cycling to school, and engage thousands of community members in policy discussions. Prior to launching her independent consulting practice in 2020, Jamie worked for Share the Road Cycling Coalition, Green Communities Canada, and right here for EnviroCentre. And she also holds a master's degree in geography from McMaster University and is an alumnus of the Maytree Policy School. Once again, welcome to everyone in our audience. Jamie, I'm going to turn it over to you. You have the digital floor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jen, and thank you to EnviroCentre for the invitation to be here today as part of the Drive Clean speaker series. I'm really excited to talk to you about a topic that I'm super excited about, micromobility and electrification. So, so just to kind of introduce myself a little bit. So my name is Jamie Stuckless, and I'm the owner and principal consultant at Stuckless Consulting, Inc. I am currently based in Hamilton, Ontario, but I grew up in Ottawa. So I'm very familiar with Ottawa and the community where you are based today. As was mentioned in my intro bio, I've had the opportunity to work and volunteer in the active transportation space in Ontario for over a decade with organizations like Green Communities Canada, EnviroCentre, and Cycle Hamilton. And I was really lucky. I was able to do my master's thesis studying the psychology of transportation behavior, specifically focused on cycling at McMaster University in 2010. So, to get to it today, when we're talking about a topic that's kind of as big and as new as micromobility, I thought that it would be important to start from a space of what is micromobility? And so this answer might vary a little bit depending on what website you visit or who you're talking to. But to me, I like to think of micromobility as a category of small, lightweight vehicles that are propelled either by human power or by electric power, and that typically go up to a maximum of 25 kilometers an hour. But of course, that depends on the local rules. Micromobility devices can be privately owned or part of shared systems like bike share and e-scooter share. And for those of you who are able to see my screen, I have a picture at the top from the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy that kind of shows some pictures of some of the different types of devices that we would consider to be micromobility devices. So we have some images of kick-style scooters, or kick-style e-scooters, bicycles and e-bicycles, cargo bikes and e-cargo bikes, skateboards and rickshaws. Something that micromobility is not, it is not larger internal combustion engine vehicles like cars or mopeds. So in the presentation today, I wanted to share some information with you about opportunities for micromobility and some of the policies that are taking hold here in Ottawa and across Ontario. But first, I wanted to start by hearing from you about any experiences that you may have had with micromobility. And so we're going to use a website called menti.com to do a couple online polls. Now, this is a website that you can access in two ways. One is by clicking on the link that EnviroCentre has just shared in the chat box. You do not need an account to use menti.com. If you click on that link, you should just be brought to the website and you'll be able to participate. If you're using a device and don't have the ability to click on that link, you can also open a browser and visit menti.com and type in the code that I've written out on the screen. And I will read that code out now for anyone who isn't able to see my screen. So the code at menti.com is 53147623. So again, you can click on the link in the chat, or you can visit menti.com and enter the code 53147623. All right. So, whoops. We're going to ask a series of 4 questions, and I'm sharing my screen now so that you can see the answers as they come in. So the first question that we're asking people is, have you ridden on a micromobility device in the past 2 years? And we've got 3 people saying yes and 2 people saying no. So I will pause for maybe about 20 more seconds while people figure out the Menti website, and maybe we'll get another answer or 2. We just got another one, somebody who's ridden a micromobility device. That's great. I'll wait for about another 10 seconds. Okay, so a mix here, almost half and half. 4 people have ridden a micromobility device in the last 2 years, and 3 have not. All right, so the next question should now appear on your screen. And the question is, which kinds of devices have you ridden in the past 2 years? And I believe you should be able to select 3 options. You can choose 1 if you want, but you can select up to 3. And the options are bicycle, including a cargo bicycle, electric bicycle, including electric cargo bicycles, kick-style scooters, electric kick-style scooters, skateboards, one-wheels, rickshaw, and other. And if you select other and feel like typing into the chat what your other is, please feel free to do so. All right, so we're seeing lots of bicycle riders come in, 1 e-bike rider, 1 electric scooter rider, and 2 people under other. Again, if you feel comfortable sharing in the chat what your other is, I'd be happy to add that into the poll for the next time. So I'll pause. I think we've got 8, so we'll give you 10 more seconds and then we'll move on. All right, so this question is a little bit different. We're inviting you, it's an open-ended question, so you're able to type in your thoughts in sentence or paragraph form. And the question is, what opportunities do you see for micromobility in your community? And I'll let you know the next question is about the concerns that you have. So don't feel like you need to get your concerns in under this one. We'll start with the opportunities. And then the next question is any of the kind of concerns or challenges that you have. Great, and thank you to Lucas for sharing in the chat, electric wheelchair. I will make sure to include that on the graph next time. Thank you. Okay, starting to see some answers come in. So Micromobility is seen as cost-effective, healthy for the last mile, a smaller carbon footprint, reducing the reliance on fossil fuels, delivering goods and supplies within the core, 5-minute communities, reducing traffic and gas emissions, e-bikes on bike paths, safe is a City of Ottawa on board. I'll note that as a concern to discuss. All right, if you are still typing in your response, just get it in. There we go. Integration among modes where micromobility uses are easily integrated with transit. So this is great. Thank you so much for providing this feedback. We'll go to the last question here. And now it's an opportunity to share some of the concerns that you might have about micromobility in your community. So this is challenges, things that worry you, barriers, anything that maybe you're a little worried about with micromobility.
Hi, folks. So Jamie seems to have left momentarily. I'm sure that she'll be back. I will be sure to let her in when she enters the waiting room, and then we'll get started again.
Thanks, Mandy. I was busy putting in my answer over on a different screen, so sorry to say I didn't notice her hop off, but I'm sure she's going to hop right back on. That will be her there. Hi, Jamie. Welcome back. That's the world we live in these days.
So I'm hotspotting my phone, but it looks like you guys have provided some great answers. Jen, did somebody already read these out or?
No, because I can't actually see anything but my own.
Oh, because I'm not sharing my screen because I left. Here we go. Okay, can you guys see my screen, see and hear me?
We are back on track.
Okay, sorry about that. So great, yeah, thank you for providing these answers. You know, some things about car traffic being too fast, the municipality is too spread out, accessibility and conflict for pedestrians, costs of e-scooters are expensive, e-scooters scattered along the sidewalks and walkways, lots of comments about safety. So this is really helpful, and what I'm going to do is just take note of all of these concerns, and we can come back to them at the end of the presentation as part of the Q&A and kind of try to address some of them as well. So thank you very much for your patience with my internet outage, as well as your willingness to participate in the Menti poll. I find that a really helpful way to get a sense of who's on the call and what your level of interest and engagement already with the topic is. So thank you for that. And so what I wanted to do now is kind of talk in a little bit more depth about micromobility. And so I wanted to start by that I definitely was not always the micromobility enthusiast that I am now. and you know, I didn't know a lot about e-bikes or e-scooters, and you know, they maybe felt like they were on the side of the conversation a little bit. But over the last few years, having the opportunity to ride some of these different devices, be immersed in the research and learn some of the like benefits of micromobility for communities and people, and to start to learn some of the best practices as well that are being implemented in communities across North America and Europe to deal with a lot of the challenges and concerns that you highlighted in your survey results, and just learning that you know, there are solutions to a lot of the problems. We often just from a policy perspective have to be willing to implement them. Really got me excited and enthusiastic about micromobility as a really important tool for moving forward in communities. And so a few of the benefits that I see to supporting micromobility include providing more options for people when they're taking short trips. So the only option is not a motor vehicle trip. They have a lot of different micromobility options depending on what the purpose of the trip is. You know, with micromobility, it's in the name, but you have a smaller per vehicle impact, both in terms of your environmental footprint, as many of you mentioned, but also the space that you take up in the community and on the road. Micromobility can also be a really important support to public transit, as some of you mentioned in the answers there, helping people make that first and last mile connection to transit, particularly important in communities who have made investments in transit, like Ottawa and the LRT, where there's kind of one destination that everybody needs to get to, and in communities where, you know, transit is not as connected in communities and people need that e-bike or scooter to get to the nearest bus stop. I think that electrification to me has been one of the really big drivers of the growth in micromobility and the importance of the micromobility conversation. And so the introduction and growth of things like electric bicycles and electric kick-style e-scooters really have been found to help more people travel further for longer and with more cargo. So just opening up micromobility as an option for way more people and for way more trips than maybe previously was possible with a conventional bike. And I did just want to pause here to note that when I say e-scooter, I put a picture up here of me riding an e-scooter because I wanted to clarify what we're talking about. Because sometimes we can talk about e-scooters and some of us are picturing the device that you see on my screen, which is kind of like a long skinny skateboard with two wheels and a big handlebar that comes up. But some people might be picturing a moped, more like an electric motorcycle. And so I to clarify that when I'm talking about e-scooters, I'm talking about the kick-style devices and not the mopeds. And then, so lastly, another really big benefit I see of micromobility is the option for both private ownership as well as shared use through systems like bike share and e-scooter share, which can really create a lot of flexibility in terms of not always having to do a round trip, not needing to find secure parking. It can reduce the cost of access. All of a sudden, that $3,000 e-bike is available to you for $10 a month at bike share instead of having to spend $3,000 to access one, and also increasing access to more people using these types of devices. And so I don't want you to just kind of have to take my word for it that micromobility is great and there's a lot of different benefits to it. So the next few slides are some research and case studies and reports that kind of illustrate a few of the points that I was just making. And so this first slide, as well as a few of the subsequent slides, are actually pulled from the North American Bike Share and Scooter Share Association's 2020 State of the Industry Report. This organization is also referred to as NABSA, and every year they publish an industry report about shared micromobility across North America. And I wanted to show you this map because it shows you that there are tens of millions of trips being made every year, this is just from 2020, on bike share and e-scooter share across North America. I think Canada's number is pretty impressive, 8.6 million trips. I find that impressive given I think we only have 14 shared micromobility systems across the entire country, but we don't have a lot of systems, but people are making a huge number of trips. So where there are systems for shared micromobility, there's interest and there's demand. In the States, they're seeing almost 70 million trips a year. And in Mexico, it's almost 7 million trips a year. And what's interesting, sometimes the conversation is about, well, are these trips just replacing walking trips or public transit trips or trips that we would generally otherwise consider, sustainable or active trips? And yes, in some cases, those are the trips that are being replaced by bike share and scooter share. But I wanted to draw your attention to the 36% image over top of that car, because the research from NABCA shows that actually 36% of all shared micromobility trips made in 2020 were replacing a car trip. And because of that car trip replacement, shared micromobility users offset approximately 29 million pounds of CO2 emissions in 2020 alone by making those trips. So not only is there demand and interest in micromobility when it's provided, people are also using it for a variety of purposes, including replacing car trips and getting actually leading to some of that modal shift that many people in transportation are seeking to encourage. So this next image, I've actually pulled from the Cycling Promotion Fund. And this one kind of relates to that thing I was talking about taking up less space in the community with micromobility. And so when it comes to electrification, the conversation, particularly at the federal level, has really been dominated by the electrification of vehicles or motor vehicles. Don't get me wrong, that's really important. Making that shift feasible for people and companies to be able to change from a combustion engine vehicle to an electric vehicle is very important. But it is not the only electrification conversation that matters, and it certainly won't address all of our issues when it comes to traffic congestion and environmental footprint. So what you see on your screen here is basically a picture of how much space is required to move 48 people if they're in a car, an electric car, or an autonomous car. And if you're able to see the screen, what you see is that it's just the exact same picture 3 times over, because an electric car doesn't take up any less space than a combustion engine car. So we still need to pave over land and farmland to make roads and to make parking lots, and the loss of permeable surfaces and, the creation of traffic congestion. That doesn't go away with electric vehicles in the same way that it does with micromobility. So it's not an either or conversation. As I said, the conversation about electric vehicles, incredibly important. What I'd like to see is an opening up and more focus on things like incentivizing electric bicycles, electric scooters, electric wheelchairs, electric rickshaws and cargo bikes, and finding ways to give people more choices than a car or an electric car. Now, on to the conversation about public transit, which many of you highlighted in the Menti results. It's not just a guess. People are actually using micromobility to access transit. And from that same NABCA report, 50% of shared micromobility users in 2020 reported that they used micromobility to connect to transit. And of all of those millions of trips that were made, I think it's 84 million trips that were made in 2020, 16% of them were used to connect to transit. So just kind of illustrating the real importance of micromobility in enhancing and complementing our transit systems and helping more people have more choices in how they get there. And lastly, I wanted to share this slide because it's not just about individual and private users. Corporations and commercial interests are also finding opportunities in micromobility. And so this is a picture from Curbside Cycles in Toronto based on a pilot that they were doing with FedEx Express, where they found that a cargo bike could do more parcel drops in an hour than a cargo van. And I understand that not only is there now a a growing pilot in Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver. I understand from EnviroCentre that there's also one starting up in Ottawa as well. So we're with micromobility, and particularly with the electrification of cargo bikes, we're starting to see more and more companies, make this switch because they can get through traffic faster. It's easier to find a parking spot. They can make more drops per hour than if they were trying to navigate a congested urban area by van. And I think that, that could be a really great step. And I know that, FedEx Express is actually hiring a lot of e-bike couriers. I just saw that come across the other day. So they're trying to grow across Canada, and I'm really interested in keeping track of that. And so now I kind of wanted to shift a little bit. We talked a bit about the benefits and how the sector is growing and changing. And I wanted to end by sharing some of the micromobility policies that are being implemented right here in Ontario and in Ottawa to actually adapt to this growing sector. Because Ontario has been making policy changes to encourage micromobility. So first is one that you may be familiar with because you do have a kick-style e-scooter pilot in Ottawa. And so this is a pilot program that was launched by the province of Ontario at the beginning of 2020. And prior to this pilot, the electric kick-style e-scooters were actually prohibited on public roadways under the Highway Traffic Act. With this 5-year pilot, they are allowed, but they're not just allowed anywhere. Municipalities actually have to take the extra step of opting in and passing a bylaw to participate in the electric scooter pilot. So although they are permitted everywhere in Ontario under the Highway Traffic Act, only municipalities that have passed a bylaw and opted in actually permit the e-scooters on their public roads. So Ottawa was the first. You guys are really leading the way when it comes to micromobility in so many ways, but Ottawa was the first to launch an e-scooter pilot. It was followed closely by Windsor and now by Hamilton as well. And so as part of the pilot, the province did set a few guidelines, like having a maximum speed of 24 kilometers an hour and recommending that the devices not be used on sidewalks. But I wanted to emphasize that municipalities really have been given a lot of power to decide the specifics of each of the programs. So they really do differ from community to community. And one thing I also wanted to highlight about these electric kick-style scooters, which is something that can kind of be confusing, is the difference between personal use and permits for shared systems. So municipalities can allow the personal or private use of e-scooters without giving a permit to communities or companies like Bird and Skip and Lime. I think when we think of e-scooters, it's easy to jump immediately to the corporate side and, oh yeah, that's Lime and Bird and those scooters. But you can actually also buy an e-scooter and use it in your community. And I just wanted to highlight that difference because here in Hamilton, where I live, personal use of e-scooters has been allowed for almost a year, but there have been no permits granted for shared scooter systems. So if I wanted to go out and buy one, I could use one, but we don't yet have a shared system. We're expected to get one next spring. So there's a few differences in different communities. Another way that Ontario is really working to adapt and encourage micromobility is by updating the definitions and rules of the road for electric bicycles. Now, for a really long time, it might surprise you to learn that electric bicycles were actually defined by the federal government under the Motor Vehicle Safety Act. But a few years, Transport Canada decided that they didn't want to regulate e-bikes anymore, and they downloaded that responsibility to the provinces as of February 2020. And so Ontario is one of the first provinces to actually come out with a new definition for electric bicycles, and that was passed as part of the MOMS Act, or the Moving Ontarians More Safely Act, that was passed at the provincial level of June of this year. And so I did just want to highlight too, everything I'm saying here, this is a bit confusing. Although the MOMS Act passed and included new definitions for e-bikes, those definitions are not yet in effect, and they will not be in effect until the province creates and adopts a set of regulations to actually regulate the use of e-bikes. So everything I'm going to tell you about new definitions, not in place yet, but it has been passed. the policy process. It's very interesting. So in terms of, there were some good things to come out of the new definitions for electric bicycles. For instance, the province has created different categories for electric bicycles, and they actually differentiate now between pedal assist bikes, which is what you can see a picture of on my screen, and what we may call mopeds or electric motorcycles. Previously, under the federal definition, these were all lumped together into one category. And so you could have municipalities banning e-bikes on their trails because they didn't want mopeds speeding along the trails, but then also inadvertently banning anybody who is riding an e-bike. So now Ontario is saying municipalities have the power to differentiate between them, which I think is really positive. The province has also harmonized helmet laws for e-bikes with the laws for bicycles. So they are mandatory for everyone under 18 years of age, whereas previously everybody of all ages on an e-bike had to wear a helmet, which can be really challenging for things like bike share. And another thing that happened was they set a maximum weight for e-bikes of 55 kilograms. Now, I don't want to get into a huge, we don't have to dig too deep into the policy issues on this, but I wanted to highlight because it is something that's being heavily discussed in communities like Ottawa. The 55 kilogram limit excludes a lot of e-bikes. And you can see on my screen here, I've got a Babo City cargo bike, which is Canada's most popular family style cargo bike. There's another bike at the bottom by Van Ram, which is a disability trike to carry an adult passenger on the front, which is also 60 kilograms, so 5 kilograms over that maximum. And another bike, the Van Ram Chat, which is frequently used for the Cycling Without Age program, which is 97 kilograms. So although there were many good things that happened with the new provincial definitions for e-bikes, they've actually excluded a lot of e-bikes with their new definition, which is unfortunate, and which is really the impetus for the last thing I'll talk about, which is big in Ottawa right now, the electric cargo bicycle pilot project. So this is another provincial pilot project that I believe is going to last for 5 years, and it's meant to capture all of those larger e-cargo bikes that are over 55 kilograms. Just like the scooter pilot, municipalities have to opt into it. So to me, that's a really big concern that if your municipality doesn't opt into it, all of a sudden your 60 kilogram e-bike is not permitted. Luckily for you, Ottawa is the first and I believe only municipality to adopt the electric cargo bike pilot project. You guys moved so quickly on that. I believe it just passed within the last month. And you had some interesting specifications in there that I'm happy to, chat about during the Q&A. But the program does recognize that, a family style Babo City is different than like a heavier bike that FedEx might be using. So Ottawa is going to differentiate between personal and commercial e-cargo bikes. Commercial bikes will require a logo. Personal e-cargo bikes will be permitted on all cycling infrastructure, including multi-use paths, but commercial e-cargo bikes will not be allowed on multi-use paths. And none of the e-cargo bikes will be permitted on sidewalks for pedestrian safety. So with that, that's kind of all of the information that I wanted to share. I think that there's so much opportunity for micromobility. I'm pleased to see the province and jurisdictions like Ottawa making moves to really create a policy space where we can grow this sector. There's obviously a lot of complications in different vehicle types and a lot of commercial interests in there as well as individual interests. So, making sure that we are enacting the right rules and helping people access these vehicles as much as possible is super important, and we are not there yet. And we are not as far along as some communities, especially in Europe, where micromobility has really taken off. I think two of the concerns that I wanted to pull and just kind of highlight before we go to the Q&A that had been mentioned a few times by you in the Menti poll was just around this idea of like safety of some of these micromobility devices interacting, which is really important, as well as the idea that cars are too fast and these devices are really small. So I'll start with that one because being involved in these policy conversations, it always comes up from elected officials, public service, media. Well, how can we allow electric scooters, on roads where there's cars moving so quickly. And that is absolutely the case. And, cars are moving too fast, and we have provided too little space for people using micromobility. And I think a really big conflict for all types of micromobility is between, especially people biking and scooting and people using the sidewalk. And what I always say to that is, we can't, I got asked by a reporter one time, what do you say to somebody who's trying to make the choice between riding their scooter on the road and on the sidewalk? And my response is, they need to call and email their counselor and show up at council and say, stop making me make this choice. It is unfair for me on a device, any type of micromobility device, to have to choose between riding in a road with a 60-kilometer-an-hour car or truck speeding by me, or making the decision to ride up on the sidewalk where I know I might be endangering pedestrians. That's an impossible choice. And yet we keep putting that on individuals. So one of the things that isn't addressed in any of these policies that I've talked about is a commitment to build more and safer separated space, both for people walking and people using micromobility. And that absolutely needs to be part of this. So there needs to be funding for infrastructure. There needs to be policy commitments to building infrastructure, because people with those concerns, you're absolutely right. You can't just throw 1,000 e-scooters at a community and expect that everybody's going to be safe if you haven't built the space. But it's not, to me, an issue that bikes or scooters or e-cargo bikes are inherently unsafe themselves, is that we haven't built the space for them. And we can't just, expect that it will work itself out, because it won't. And so I think that kind of also ties in. A big one is, should e-bikes and e-cargo bikes be allowed on multi-use paths? I think that's a really contextual question and can depend on the size and scope of the pathways that are in your community. And so it's an important local discussion, but one study, actually it's two studies combined into one, that I always cite is that so there was a study in Europe and the United States that found that people on e-bikes went typically 1 to 4 kilometers faster than people on conventional bikes. And so it's not an issue of the device per se, it's an issue of speed overall. And I do think that we have to really question whether it's fair for us to say anyone on an e-bike can't be on this path because they might go 32 kilometers an hour. Well, they also might not, and they might need that electric e-bike to make the trip. And so we really have to kind of actually, look at the research and have these critical conversations, and then also ensure that we are building spaces that safely accommodate various speeds and users. So I just wanted to address those two concerns, because I saw they came up in the Menti poll. They come up in, almost all of these micromobility conversations. But now I would be more than happy to answer the questions that you have, either in the chat or by turning on your audio and video and joining us that way. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. That was so interesting. There is one chat question here, and then of course I have about 400 in my head if no one else sends any. So the question that is here is, now I happen to know there's nothing available right now in Ottawa, but can you give any examples of places where there are currently incentives for buying e-bikes or tax credits for sharing programs? Either of those things, and do they work, is my follow-up to that. Is there any proof in the pudding that offering an incentive increases people's ability to buy these devices? I know we have them for cars. Great amount of money goes towards purchasing vehicles at the federal level. We have a $5,000 rebate, but we don't have anything, as far as I know, anywhere in Canada, do we, for e-bikes?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I'm just going to share my screen again, because I've made a map of available e-bike and bicycling incentives around the world. So just going to zoom in here on Canada. So we do have a few programs, like it depends on where you live. Mostly it's been the provinces who have taken the lead. So the Yukon has a provincial program for e-bikes. British Columbia has one as well. The city of Edmonton had one for a while. It was supposed to be a 3-year program, but they discontinued it after 1 year. not because of a lack of interest. I think there's 800 applicants for like 50 rebates. Quebec has a rebate program that came out within the last year, and Nova Scotia also has a fairly new e-bike program. So certainly several provinces have taken the lead. There's also incentive programs in the United States and across Europe. I think that they are really important because I believe the average price of an e-bike in Canada is $3,000, and that's the average. You know, they can be very expensive, and so providing financial incentives is incredibly important. I can put the link to this map in the chat if people want to check it out, because I've also linked to a lot of different research about rebate programs, and maybe you'll see here on my screen. My question is, so why just subsidize e-bikes and not conventional bikes? Because one thing I've been thinking a lot about with, you know, these rebate programs is we subsidize electric vehicles over combustion engine vehicles because e-vehicles are a greener choice. Why would we subsidize e-bikes over conventional bikes when they're both a very green choice? And yes, a $3,000 bike is incredibly expensive and hard to access, but a $400 conventional bike can be just as inaccessible and expensive for many people and should be subsidized. And so one of the things that I've also emphasized in this map is, particularly in Europe, countries that have come out with subsidies that are for conventional bikes as well as subsidizing bike repair and memberships to bike share and scooter share systems. We should be finding ways to make all forms of micromobility more accessible. And I would love for these conversations to be broader than, you know, I think e-bike's a great place to start. But the other piece with that is, you know, a lot of these programs are a 15% rebate. Well, if it's a $3,000 bike, first of all, you need to be able to pay that $3,000 up front, wait for the rebate, and still afford the 75% of the cost. So, you know, there's also opportunities to go bigger and broader and have on-site vouchers and partnerships with bike shops. And this is a conversation that I'm really hoping with the new National Active Transportation Strategy that we're able to have in a way that builds on some of the work that's been done here in Canada, but also around the world, and just make it a really great program that makes all forms of micromobility so much more accessible financially.
Yeah, I do know there are programs also for almost like micro loans for bicycles. The way we have car loans, there are some places in the world offering loans for people to buy bikes. I don't know of any locally, but I know those exist. And I would also add, not only when you were talking about, you know, the incentives replacing an electric car or replacing a combustion engine car with an electric car, replacing an e-bike or replacing a conventional bike with an e-bike also allows people to bike longer in their life. So I have an older mother and she can no longer ride a conventional bike. And so for many people, it extends the life of your cycling and being able to be out and active and choosing that as a true option and extending that. So Lucas had a question, and I can answer this from the Ottawa perspective, but maybe other places have different answers. So the question is, are micromobility devices offered to the public to use during the winter? And if so, are they stored in sheltered areas so they are protected from the snow or freezing rain? So I can tell you, Lucas, that in Ottawa, our pilot program, they bring all those scooters in at the end of October, and then they will redeploy them just because of the snow clearing, salt, and all the business we have in Ottawa. It's the same as, unfortunately, in Ottawa, they take down the rack and roll for the same reason. It's just our climate we live in for these micromobility devices, but I'm not sure in other places where the weather may not quite as severe in winter time, like in Toronto or maybe down in Hamilton. Do they have them out year round?
Yeah. So as I said, I grew up in Ottawa, and I think I tried winter cycling once, and I got like halfway down the block, slipped on the ice, fell, and went back home and never tried it again. But the very first day that I moved to Hamilton, I was out in the winter on bike share, and I bike all the time in the winter because bike share is available. So I've got to say, like there's just not as much snow here at all in any comparable way to what Ottawa gets. So it is different. But both Hamilton and Toronto operate their bike share systems year round. And Toronto has electric bicycles as well, year round. I think the scooters are a bit more of a challenge in any jurisdiction because the wheels are just a lot smaller than a bicycle. So I don't know too much about what's happening with e-scooters in the winter. I think a lot of the programs do shut down, but I know for sure Hamilton and Toronto's bike share system goes year round. And I saw something that Lime was doing in Calgary right before the pandemic. They had an electric bike share system that actually had giant warm gloves permanently attached to the handlebars.
Yeah.
So that they could ride them year round.
Yeah, so you can. So in Ottawa, it's improved a lot, the winter cycling situation. So I actually do winter bike, as you know, and I've been at it since 1989 right here in Ottawa. So, and my whole entire life. And we actually have 45 kilometers of cleared infrastructure now, like cleared to the asphalt in the core. So if you live within the core, it's pretty doable. None of that existed even 10 years ago here, and it really has opened up the micromobility options for people. And I know there are e-fat bikes, there are and e-bikes do work in the winter time, much like a e-car or a ZEV. You're going to get a little bit less range because you are reliant on a battery, but they do work, and you can expect the range of your e-bike to drop about 30% really in the winter time, which goes really nicely to our next question, which is what's the available public charging infrastructure for micromobility? So most of these, I believe, just take a regular plug like you have in your wall socket. I don't know of any of those that are just publicly available, but most people would have them in their office and home. But I know the e-bike we use for EnviroCentre are like company bike. It goes 60 kilometers on one charge. So for most things, it's pretty good. Do you have anything else to add for that? Do you know of any public charging infrastructure for micromobility elsewhere, Jamie?
So the only project I'll mention is I know there's an advocacy group on Manitoulin Island that recently got a federal grant to actually purchase a series of e-charging public stations for across Manitoulin Island to encourage and invite visitors to come with like e-bikes and other electric devices and travel across Manitoulin Island. I just put in the chat an article that I wrote last year about the availability of charging stations. Definitely it kind of, you know, we don't have the same plan for public charging that we do for the charging of electric vehicles yet. But certainly, again, I know I don't always want to just look to Europe, but certainly they have created a lot more public charging options, particularly partnering with like business districts and things. So you can actually, you know, go to a center in a lockbox, charge your e-bike battery, go and get lunch, do your shopping, you know, check in at your hotel or whatnot, and then come back and get your e-bike, because yeah, we do need publicly available charging stations because it's not accessible for everyone to be able to go and sit at Starbucks or a hotel or the train station and plug it in. We need to make them publicly available. And I think some ferries in BC might be doing that, where you can kind of charge your bike on the ferry. But it honestly hasn't been a huge conversation. Thank you for the question. And it certainly is, especially in a sector where there's more and more different types of devices. It seems coming online every 6 months. You know, you create a policy and then all of a sudden there's a device that doesn't comply with it in an unexpected way. So it certainly is a challenge. And it's something that I think, you know, with the categories that Ontario has created, trying to give municipalities a lot more freedom and the ability to differentiate between those types of bikes. So a new category has been created specifically for pedal assist bicycles. And then everything else is a little bit bigger or a little bit faster than that. And municipalities can decide, well, this pathway, only pedal assist bicycles are allowed on it. But on this paved shoulder, we will allow, you know, throttle assist bikes and, you know, the motor assist bicycles. I always do find the conversation about limiting the speed of e-bikes to be a challenging one. Certainly in Europe, the speed limit is 25. Here in Ontario, in many jurisdictions across North America, we've opted for 32. I find the conversation challenging for several reasons. One, like I said, like you can go 30, I mean, I can't, but some people can, and go 30 kilometers on their non-electric bike, and they're allowed on the pathway. I don't know that there's been a really great, so like a lot of studies are just showing that it's actually infrastructure design that's going to dictate the speed more so than if you're on an e-bike or a conventional bike. So a lot of it again comes back to this like investment and commitment to well-designed infrastructure that kind of like slows you down. And even if your bike can go 32 kilometers, just not letting it go 32 kilometers. The other reason that I find the conversation challenging is because these bikes are also allowed on the road, where cars are allowed to go 200 kilometers an hour, even though they shouldn't, but they are, you know, legally allowed on a lot of these roads where you might be biking to go 80. And we're limited to, we're obsessed with this conversation about whether we should be going 25 or 32. And it just feels like sometimes the wrong conversation. So I know for pathways, it's very important. And, you know, setting a speed, again, being less focused on the device and more on the design and the speed, because you know, you don't have to be on an e-bike to go 30 kilometers an hour, and just making sure that we're then not limiting people that when they are riding that device on the road to going slower than the rest of traffic in a way that might endanger them.
Yeah, and I would add, Jacques, that we have an extra layer of challenge here in the Ottawa-Gatineau region because we have NCC rules and regulations that are different and don't fall within the city bylaw. So on an NCC pathway along the rivers, along the canals, you can only go 20 kilometers an hour no matter what you're riding, which is probably good because it's really busy and filled with families and dogs and lots of people. So yes, there is on the City of Ottawa website, Jacques, and maybe you can email me afterward. I can point you to the newest bylaw for e-bikes that was recently passed, and then the passed by council but not implemented draft bylaw for the cargo and commercial cargo bikes. We do have a draft of that has been passed by council, as Jamie was saying 2 weeks ago. So there really are all these different categories. It has to do with the weight of your bike, the width of your bike, the speed of your bike, and also what pathway. So we have different rules for the road, for a complete street, for the Laurier bike lane, for our multi-use paths. And it's really complex, and you basically need a degree in policy to get through the document like Jamie has to know where the heck you're supposed to be riding and how fast you're allowed to go.
And I would also add on to that because the federal government has downloaded the responsibility to define e-bikes to the provinces, that it's very likely that Ontario and Quebec will have different definitions and different rules.
And
I was writing a blog post for a local organization about doing one of their tour routes with an e-bike. And we have a trail here in Hamilton that's an off-road trail that goes up the escarpment. So it's a mountain climb. It's exactly where you'd want to ride your e-bike, right? So I went on the City of Hamilton's website. They had no information about e-bikes. I went on the police website. They directed you towards the province. That was the only button on there, and the province didn't say anything. And so I went out and I rode my e-bike. And 2 weeks later, my blog post was at council when someone saying, I thought e-bikes were banned on this pathway. And because you have to know which conservation authority operates that pathway, and they're not their signage on the pathway, but their website specifies that e-bikes are banned. And so it's, you know, but the City of Hamilton didn't have any information. So, you know, this is an area in which I did a lot of research and feel like, you know, I tried to understand the rules and I still didn't get it right. So I don't know how people can expect us to know what the rules are if they're not really posted anywhere.
Well, I do want to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope that you stay in touch with Jamie and her amazing work she's doing, and definitely keep in touch with EnviroCentre, and let's hopefully see each other out on some of these pathways, no matter what micromobility device we're using. I think it is the future. You know, Ottawa, as we learned, well, some of us learned yesterday that 42% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation in Ottawa. And in our, especially downtown core, this is a real option for reducing that significantly. So let's hope we see a whole bunch more of this coming down the streets and paths, and with clear rules would be really swell as well. So thanks so much, Jamie. I really appreciate your time. I think that was all we have time for. So thanks.
Thank you. And thanks for everyone's engagement and feedback. Very enjoyable conversation.